Cuba has confirmed that John Ratcliffe, the head of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, has held a meeting with government officials in Havana. His visit comes amid a deepening crisis between Washington and the communist-run island. Cuba has endured frequent power outages prompted by a U.S. fuel blockade and has now declared that its oil provisions have run out. A Cuban government statement confirmed by the CIA says both sides expressed willingness to strengthen cooperation and law enforcement. It also said Cuba poses no threat to U.S. national security and should not be regarded as a sponsor of terrorism. Well, let's cross straight over to Cecile Shay. She's a senior non-resident fellow for global security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Welcome to the program. Cecile, what does John Ratcliffe's trip to Havana tell us about the current state of U.S.-Cuban relations?
Well, first of all, the director of the CIA visiting countries is extremely common. And in particular, all directors of central intelligence tend to spend a lot of time visiting authoritarian countries because those countries tend to have fairly powerful internal intelligence apparatuses. And by meeting with the heads of the intelligence agencies, the US government is very often able to get messages to the leadership of the country that would be difficult to get to them in using another means. What is different about this visit is the CIA director's travel is usually extremely secretive. During my 26-year career in diplomacy, there were many times until I was at the senior levels that the CIA director would be in town and most of the people in the embassy didn't know. I mean, it was that secretive. So the fact that it is public from both sides now, from the Cuban side and the US side is not denying that he was there, is unusual. I think that the U.S. wanted to send a message that we are aware of the situation and of the dire situation there, and hopefully try to calm down some of the criticism against the U.S. that is occurring domestically here because of Cuba's fuel, not just shortage anymore. They apparently are virtually out of fuel. And also to send a message to the Cuban people that the U.S. is aware of their struggle. It may also be part of a effort to continue pressure on the Cuban leadership. The U.S. has been engaged in various threats, both subtle and not so subtle recently, that Cuba needs to make concessions or the U.S. may take even more drastic action against the government.
Well, as you mentioned, this visit takes place as Cuba faces a severe energy crisis, and that crisis was triggered by U.S. fuel sanctions. How is that economic pressure shaping discussions between the two countries?
Well, it's appeared for the last month or two that Cuba was actually willing to make some really significant concessions. Unlike a lot of authoritarian regimes, the Cuban leadership seems to at least care about the health and welfare of its population. They do not appear to be psychotic in the way that some leaders of some authoritarian regimes are. And so the Cubans, at least if one believes the leaks to the press, have been willing to make some extraordinary concessions to the U.S. on opening up their economy, on allowing investment from Cuban exiles back into Cuba, on releasing to the U.S. some Americans who are wanted and are currently seeking safety in Cuba. They've been there for decades in some cases. And other things that have always been important to the U.S. and that have been demands from the U.S. What the Cuban leadership has not been willing to do is step down. They have not been willing to give up power to be part of a regime change, which the U.S. has been demanding. Now, one of the challenges that all sides are facing right now, particularly the Cubans, who must be a little confused, is Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, seems to have indicated that we would accept economic concessions, economic changes, but not require the leadership to step down. Others in the government are saying leadership must step down. I think that the best thing that could happen right now, and if we had more capacity at the top of our government, which I would like to explain in a moment, if we had more people concentrating on Cuba right now, we would be able to negotiate something like okay, you can stay in power for another 2 years, but we need a transition to an election. We need a transition to an open political system while you follow through on the various economic promises that you have made now. And in return, we will lift sanctions in an orderly fashion as we see improvements on the economy and steps toward elections. But there doesn't seem to be anybody working on that.
Well, Cecile, do you see this meeting as the beginning of a new diplomatic chapter maybe in U.S.-Cuban relations, or is it really just a tactical move by Washington that's going to do whatever it wants?
I mean, that's a good question. Of course, relations were much better during the Obama administration. We had begun to lower sanctions. It looked like there might be some movement toward normalizing relations. And that began to really fall apart during the Biden administration. And of course, now relations between Cuba and the U.S. are as bad as they have been in the last several decades, for sure. I think that President Trump has too much on his plate right now, frankly. And if he is practical, and I think that he is a practical man, he will realize that this is something that he can get off of his plate without needing military force. You know, there's a danger. He seems to think the military can solve all of his problems. We've seen in Iran that is simply not true. And so we'll see. But I think that the president knows right now that he is overextended and would like to see some forward movement quickly on the Cuba situation.
Cecile Shay, Senior Non-Resident Fellow for Global Security and Diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you.